The knock didn't just echo on the wooden door. It felt like it carried every mile of rain-soaked road she had walked to get there. Lydia Harper stood on the edge of a weather-beaten ranch gate in northern Texas, the wind pushing cold sheets of rain across the open land as if the sky itself was trying to turn her away. Her coat clung to her shoulders, heavy with water, and behind her stood 5 young girls, each of them holding onto the fabric of her dress or each other, their small shoes sinking slightly into the wet dirt. None of them spoke. They had no energy left for words after the long journey that had taken everything they had. Lydia raised her hand again and knocked once more, slower this time, like she was afraid even the sound of her hope might break. Inside the house, Caleb Whitmore stood still. He had heard knocks before, but something about this one felt different, not loud, not urgent in a simple way, but heavy, like it carried history in it. He was a widowed rancher, a man who had learned to measure time by silence rather than sound, and he did not move right away. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw them. A woman holding herself together with sheer will, and 5 small silhouettes behind her, fragile against the vastness of the land. Caleb's hand rested on the edge of the kitchen table where an empty coffee mug sat, cold and untouched. For a moment, he considered not opening the door. Life on the ranch had taught him that every new arrival carried weight, and he was already carrying enough. But then he noticed the smallest girl shift her footing, her shoes barely protecting her from the mud, and something in him tightened. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition of something he could not yet name. Outside, Lydia lowered her head slightly, rain dripping from her hair, and when she spoke, her voice barely carried through the storm. "I have 5 daughters," she said, each word shaking as if it cost her something to say it out loud. The girls behind her stayed close, their eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something they did not fully understand. Caleb finally moved. Slowly, he walked across the wooden floor of the ranch house, each step deliberate, as though the floor itself was asking him to think twice. His past lingered in every corner of that home, especially in the quiet spaces where laughter used to be. When he reached the door, he paused, one hand resting on the iron handle, feeling the cold through the metal. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked through the small glass pane again, taking in the scene. A woman standing on the edge of exhaustion, and 5 children standing on the edge of uncertainty. The rain softened for a moment, as if even the storm was listening. Caleb exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than just hesitation, and then he turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the warmth of the ranch light spilling out into the storm. Lydia looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time, and in that brief silence between them, neither of them spoke, because something unspoken had already begun to change the shape of both their lives. The moment the door opened, the sound of the storm seemed to hesitate for just a second, as if it had been expecting this exact point in time. Caleb Whitmore stood in the doorway of his ranch house, the warm light from behind him spilling across the rain-soaked porch, creating a fragile boundary between shelter and the wide, unforgiving land outside. Lydia Harper did not step forward immediately. She simply held his gaze, her breath uneven, her hands still trembling slightly from the cold and the weight of the journey that had brought her here. Behind her, the 5 girls shifted closer together, their small figures half hidden by the rain and the dimness of the evening. Caleb noticed everything in silence. The way the eldest girl tried to stand in front of the others despite her own exhaustion. The way the youngest clung to Lydia's coat, as if letting go might mean disappearing entirely. None of them spoke. The only sound was the steady rainfall tapping against the wooden porch and the distant wind moving through the open fields. Caleb finally stepped slightly aside, not as an invitation spoken aloud, but as an opening that could be accepted or refused. Lydia hesitated, her eyes scanning his face, trying to read something. There, something that might tell her whether this was safety or another closed door waiting to happen. "We do not have anywhere else," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from days without rest and nights without certainty. The words did not sound like a request. They sounded like the last remaining truth she had left to offer. Caleb did not respond right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the open land stretching behind them, the muddy path that led to nowhere welcoming. He understood distance. He understood what it meant to arrive somewhere only because everywhere else had already been taken away. Slowly, he stepped back fully and opened the door wider. The girls flinched slightly at first, unsure whether moving forward was allowed, but Lydia placed a gentle hand on the shoulder of the eldest child and guided them in. One by one, they crossed the threshold. The wooden floor inside creaked softly under their wet shoes, a sound that felt strangely loud in the stillness of the house. Caleb closed the door behind them, and for a moment, the storm felt far away, like something happening in another world. The interior of the ranch was simple. A long wooden table stood in the center of the room. A stove burned faintly in the corner, giving off a low heat that had not fully warmed the house yet. There were signs of life here, but also signs of long silence, spaces that had been lived in alone for too long. Lydia stood near the entrance, unsure where to place herself, while the children stayed close together, their eyes slowly adjusting to the unfamiliar safety of being indoors. Caleb moved to the stove without speaking and added more wood, the fire responding with a quiet strength that spread warmth into the room. It was not hospitality yet, not kindness expressed in words, but it was something that could become it. One of the younger girls coughed softly, and Lydia immediately turned to her, brushing damp hair away from her forehead. Caleb watched this small act of care, and something inside him shifted in a way he did not fully understand. He had seen survival before, but not always with gentleness still attached to it. The eldest girl finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Are we going to stay here?" The question hung in the air longer than expected. Lydia did not answer right away, because she did not know the answer. Caleb turned slightly, looking at them again, truly looking this time, not as visitors, but as people who had stepped into a space that no longer belonged only to him. The rain continued outside, steady and unrelenting, pressing against the windows like a reminder of the world they had left behind. Inside, the fire grew stronger, and for the first time since the knock on the door, no one moved to leave. The morning light crept slowly over the wide Texas horizon, soft and pale, as if the sun itself was unsure about entering the day. Inside the ranch house, the warmth from the small stove had faded into a steady comfort rather than a strong heat, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the storm from the night before. Caleb Whitmore was already awake, standing near the kitchen counter with his hands resting on the edge of worn wood, staring at nothing in particular, but thinking about everything at once. He was not used to sharing his space, not anymore, and yet the presence of 6 new lives inside his home had not disappeared with the night. Lydia Harper was the first to move among them. She sat upright on the simple couch near the window, watching her 5 daughters as they slept in uneven positions across blankets that Caleb had silently placed there hours earlier. Their shoes were lined neatly near the door, still damp from the rain, and their breathing was slow, finally steady after days of uncertainty. Lydia's fingers brushed lightly through the hair of the youngest girl who had shifted closer in her sleep, as if even unconsciousness still sought comfort. Caleb moved quietly toward the cupboard. It was not large, and it was not full, but it contained enough to make a beginning. A few pieces of bread, some preserved fruit, and a small container of milk that had survived longer than he had expected. He placed everything on the table without announcing it, without calling attention to the gesture, because he did not know yet how to turn action into words. Lydia noticed immediately. She stood slowly, careful not to wake the children, and approached the table. For a moment she did not speak. She simply looked at the food as if it might disappear if acknowledged too quickly. Caleb kept his gaze lowered, focused on pouring water into a tin cup. "It is not much," he said finally, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had not spoken much in a long time. Lydia shook her head slightly, almost in disbelief. "It is more than we have had in days," she replied, her voice quieter than before, no longer shaped by exhaustion alone, but by something closer to relief. One by one, the children began to wake. The eldest sat up first, blinking as she adjusted to the unfamiliar idea of a roof that did not leak, a floor that did not shake with wind. The middle girls followed, their movements slow but curious, their eyes scanning the room as if it might change if looked at long enough. The youngest remained curled for a moment longer before Lydia gently helped her sit upright. Caleb placed the bread on the table and stepped back slightly, giving space that felt both intentional and uncertain. The children did not rush. Hunger was present, but so was hesitation, as if they were afraid that taking too much might cause the moment to disappear. Lydia broke the first piece and handed it to the youngest child. That small action seemed to unlock the rest. Slowly, carefully, the girls began to eat, their hands holding the food with a kind of reverence that made the silence in the room feel even deeper. Caleb watched without interruption. He had seen hunger before in distant ways, in passing moments, but seeing it seated at his own table made it something else entirely. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, personal, and unsettling in its simplicity. Lydia finally sat down, taking a small piece of bread for herself, but she paused before eating. "We did not expect anyone to open the door," she said softly, not looking at him directly. Caleb responded after a moment, his eyes still on the table. "Out here, doors stay closed more often than they open." The words were not meant as comfort, but they settled in the room anyway. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, dry and open beneath a clearing sky. Inside, the small sounds of children eating filled the space that had once been defined only by silence. For the first time since the knock on the door, the ranch did not feel empty. It felt occupied, not with noise, but with presence. Caleb stepped toward the window, looking out at the horizon, while behind him Lydia watched her daughters eat with a stillness that carried something close to disbelief. The day had begun, not with answers, but with something that felt like the first fragile step away from loss. The afternoon settled gently over the ranch, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards and stretching light through the windows in thin golden lines. Outside, the land was still damp from the night before, but the sky had cleared into a soft blue that made everything look almost calm, as if the storm had never truly happened. Inside the house, however, calm did not mean peace. It meant adjustment, quiet observation, and the careful learning of strangers now forced to share the same space. Lydia Harper was in the kitchen area, washing a tin cup with slow, deliberate movements, even though there was very little water and even less need for cleanliness in a place that already felt worn by time. She was not cleaning for necessity alone. She was cleaning because it gave her hands something to do while her mind tried to understand where they were. Her 5 daughters were scattered through the main room, each of them finding small corners of safety. The eldest sat near the window, watching the outside fields with a gaze that carried both curiosity and caution. The middle 2 were quietly drawing shapes in the dust on a small wooden table, their fingers tracing lines as if they were trying to make sense of a new world through simple patterns. The youngest remained close to Lydia's presence, following her movements with silent trust that had not yet been tested again. Caleb Whitmore stood near the barn door, looking out across the ranch. The land belonged to him in the legal sense, but in moments like this, it felt larger than ownership, like something that existed beyond control or understanding. He adjusted a piece of rope hanging from a hook near the wall, though there was nothing wrong with it. It was an action without purpose, a habit formed from years of working alone. He could hear the faint sounds from inside the house, even from where he stood. The soft movement of chairs, the quiet steps of children, the occasional whisper of Lydia's voice. These sounds were unfamiliar in his life, yet they did not feel entirely foreign anymore. Still, he did not step back inside immediately. There was distance in him, not from dislike or rejection, but from something deeper that had not yet decided how to open again. Lydia eventually stepped outside, noticing him standing near the barn. She paused at the threshold for a moment, then walked slowly across the yard. The ground was uneven, and small patches of dry grass bent beneath her steps. She stopped a few feet away from him, not too close, not too far. "The children are resting," she said quietly, as if giving an update to a situation rather than starting a conversation. Caleb nodded slightly, without turning fully toward her. "That is good," he replied. There was a pause between them, not uncomfortable, but uncertain, like both were waiting for a direction that neither had yet agreed to give. Lydia looked toward the barn, then back at the house. "We do not want to be a burden," she said, her voice steady but careful. Caleb finally turned his head slightly, enough to meet her eyes. "A burden is something that does not move," he said after a moment. "You all are already moving." The words were not comforting in a direct way, but they carried something grounded, something practical that made them feel real. Lydia absorbed them without response, her hands folding together in front of her. Inside the house, one of the children laughed softly at something small and unimportant, the sound drifting through the open window and reaching the yard like a reminder that life still existed in simple fragments. Caleb listened to it without comment. Lydia noticed his attention shift slightly toward the sound, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that was not distance or caution. It was recognition, not of them, but of something they were slowly beginning to represent, a possibility he had not yet allowed himself to name. The wind moved gently across the open land, brushing through the grass in slow waves. Caleb finally turned back toward the barn, picking up a tool from the nearby table without using it. Lydia remained standing where she was for a moment longer, watching the house, watching the children inside through the window, and understanding that nothing here was settled, but something had already begun to change in ways that could not be reversed. The evening settled slowly over the ranch, bringing with it a quiet that felt deeper than the daylight calm had been. The sky outside had shifted into shades of soft orange and pale violet, stretching across the horizon like a fading memory that refused to disappear completely. Inside the ranch house, the light from the oil lamps created small circles of warmth against the wooden walls, but there was still a sense of distance in the air, as if everyone present was learning how to exist in the same space without fully belonging to it yet. Caleb Whitmore stood alone in the barn again, though this time it was not because he needed to be there. It was because something in his mind had pulled him back without permission. He placed his hand on the side of an old wooden crate, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers, but his attention was not on the present. It was elsewhere, somewhere buried beneath years of silence. Lydia Harper was inside the house with her daughters. They were settling into the strange rhythm of the ranch life, still careful with every movement, still unsure of what tomorrow would require from them. The children had begun to speak more freely now, their voices soft but no longer hesitant. The eldest was helping the younger ones arrange blankets on the floor, turning the simple act of rest into something that felt almost like order. Lydia watched them with a quiet expression that mixed relief with uncertainty, because safety, when it finally arrived, did not immediately erase fear. It only gave it a place to sit still. Caleb finally moved from the barn back toward the smaller storage room attached to the side of the house. He opened a wooden door that creaked slightly from years of use and stepped inside. The room was dim, filled with old farming tools, rope coils, and boxes that had not been opened in a long time. He walked slowly toward a shelf in the back corner and stopped in front of a small wooden frame that had been turned slightly inward, as if it had been placed there but not meant to be seen. His hand hesitated before touching it. When he finally turned it, the face inside the frame came into view. A woman's photograph, slightly faded with time, but still clear enough to hold presence. Caleb did not speak. There was no need for words in a room that already knew too much silence. He simply stood there, his posture steady but his expression distant in a way that suggested memory was not something he visited lightly. The memory of his wife was not loud in his mind. It never had been. It arrived in fragments. The sound of laughter in a kitchen that no longer existed. The way morning light used to fall across the porch when life felt simpler. The feeling of hands working beside him without needing instruction. These were not dramatic recollections. They were quiet echoes that returned when the present became unfamiliar enough to allow them space. Outside the room, Lydia walked past the doorway without entering. She noticed the stillness inside but did not interrupt it. Instead, she paused briefly, holding a folded blanket in her arms, and glanced toward the open door. She did not see the photograph clearly, but she saw enough in Caleb's posture to understand that he was not fully in the present moment. She remained silent, choosing not to disturb something she could not yet define. Inside the room, Caleb finally lowered himself onto a small wooden stool. The photograph remained in his hands for a moment longer before he set it back into place, not with hesitation, but with a kind of practiced acceptance. He had learned that memory did not require constant holding to remain real. It simply needed acknowledgement. The sound of footsteps from the main house reached him faintly. Children moving. Soft conversation. Life. Continuing in its fragile, uncertain way. He listened without turning away from the shelf. For a long time, he had believed that silence was the only stable thing left in his world. But now, that belief was being challenged not by force, but by presence. Not by demands, but by something quieter, something that did not ask to replace the past, but simply existed beside it. Caleb finally stood again and stepped out of the storage room. The evening air outside felt cooler now, carrying the last traces of daylight into the night. He looked toward the house where Lydia and her daughters were staying, and for a moment, he did not think about what had been lost. He thought instead about what had unexpectedly arrived, not as a replacement, but as something that might one day learn to coexist with the parts of him that had never fully healed. The early morning light slipped gently through the thin curtains of the ranch house, casting a pale glow across the wooden floor where quiet life was beginning to stir again. The air inside was calm, but not empty, filled now with the subtle presence of movement, breathing, and the soft sounds of a household slowly learning how to exist together. Caleb Whitmore was already outside near the barn, working with his hands in silence as he checked old tools that had not been used in a long time. His movements were steady, familiar, almost automatic, as if work itself was the only language that had never abandoned him. Inside the house, Lydia Harper was kneeling near a small pile of blankets, folding them carefully while watching her daughters begin their day. The eldest was already awake, sitting near the window again, her eyes following the slow movement of clouds above the fields. The middle girls were sitting together on the floor, sharing a small piece of bread left from the morning meal, dividing it with a quiet understanding that nothing here could be taken for granted. The youngest child was holding something small in her hands, a broken wooden toy that had likely been carried all the way from their previous life, its edges worn smooth by time and travel. She turned it slowly, examining the cracked surface with confusion rather than sadness, as if trying to understand why something once whole could become incomplete. Lydia noticed it immediately and moved closer, sitting beside her daughter without speaking at first. The child looked up briefly, her eyes uncertain, then extended the broken toy toward her mother as if asking a question that did not need words. Lydia took it gently, turning it over in her hands. It was simple, just a small carved figure, likely shaped by someone long ago with care that no longer existed in the present moment. One of its arms was missing, and the base was uneven, causing it to tilt when placed on a flat surface. Lydia did not try to hide the damage. Instead, she studied it quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. Outside, Caleb returned from the barn and noticed movement through the open doorway. He paused for a moment, his attention drawn not by urgency, but by something softer, something he could not immediately define. He stepped inside slowly, wiping his hands on a worn cloth as he entered the room. The children looked up briefly but did not move away. They were still learning that his presence did not always mean instruction or distance. Lydia stood and approached him, holding the broken toy in her hand. She did not speak immediately, simply offering it to him as if trusting that he would understand without explanation. Caleb took it and turned it over in his palm. His fingers traced the uneven edges, the missing piece, the small imperfections that told a story without needing language. For a moment, he said nothing. The room remained still, the children watching quietly from where they sat. Then Caleb moved toward a small wooden drawer near the wall and opened it, revealing simple tools inside. Not many, but enough. He sat down at the edge of a chair and began to work on the toy without announcing his intention. The sound of light scraping would fill the room, slow and careful, each movement deliberate rather than rushed. The children leaned slightly forward, observing without interrupting. Lydia stood nearby, her arms folded loosely, watching not just the repair, but the way Caleb's expression changed while he worked. It was not joy, not yet, but something closer to focus that carried a sense of patience she had not seen in him before. The youngest child moved closer, kneeling beside him as he worked. She did not speak, but her presence was steady, as if she was afraid that moving away might interrupt something important. Caleb noticed her, but did not stop. Instead, he adjusted the shape of the toy slowly, smoothing the rough edges and reinforcing the weak points with quiet precision. After several minutes, he held it up slightly, examining it under the light. It was not perfect, but it stood more evenly now, able to balance on its own without falling. He placed it gently into the child's hands. She looked at it for a long moment before pressing it close to her chest. not as if it had been restored to what it once was, but as if it had become something new that still remembered where it came from. Lydia watched this without speaking. There was something in the room that had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt in the silence that followed. Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, looking at the toy in the child's hands, then at the faces around him. For the first time since their arrival, the space between them did not feel like distance. It felt like time slowly beginning to allow something different to take shape. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt different from the days before it, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sky above the ranch was overcast again, not with the harsh weight of a storm, but with a soft gray covering that dulled the horizon and made the fields look endless in a quieter way. Inside the house, there was movement earlier than usual. The children had begun waking without prompting, their bodies adjusting slowly to the rhythm of a place that no longer felt entirely unfamiliar. Lydia Harper was already at the small kitchen table, pouring a modest amount of water into a tin cup and dividing what little food remained into careful portions. Her actions were no longer rushed like they had been on the first day. There was still caution in her movements, but now it was paired with something closer to routine, as if her mind was beginning to accept the possibility that they might stay longer than expected. Caleb Whitmore was outside near the fence line, checking the perimeter of the ranch. His presence there was habitual, but his attention was not entirely on the work. He paused several times, looking back toward the house, noticing small changes that had started to appear without being announced. A pair of shoes neatly lined by the door, a small cloth hanging near the sink that had not been there before, the sound of soft conversation from inside that no longer felt like intrusion. The eldest girl stepped outside briefly, holding a folded piece of fabric in her hands. She looked around the yard before spotting Caleb near the fence. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him slowly, stopping a few feet away. She did not speak immediately, but held out the fabric. It was one of the blankets, carefully folded, now repaired at one corner where it had torn during their arrival. Caleb looked at it, then at her, and took it with a slight nod. The girl did not linger. She turned and walked back toward the house, her steps lighter than they had been before. Inside, Lydia noticed the exchange from the window. She said nothing, but her expression shifted slightly, not into relief exactly, but into recognition that something small but meaningful was forming between their presence and his silence. Caleb returned to the house a short time later. The children were gathered near the table again, this time not waiting for food, but arranging small objects they had found or been given. The repaired wooden toy sat in the center, now no longer treated as broken or fixed, but simply present, a part of their shared space. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. Lydia looked up briefly, then returned her attention to preparing a simple meal over the small stove. The air inside was warmer than it had been on the first day, not because of the fire alone, but because of familiarity slowly forming in layers. One of the younger children approached Caleb without hesitation, holding a small cup of water. She offered it to him with both hands, her expression serious in a way that only children can be when performing something they believe matters. Caleb accepted it after a brief pause. He did not say much, only a quiet acknowledgement before taking a sip and placing the cup down carefully on the table. Lydia watched this interaction without interrupting. It was small, almost insignificant on its own, but it carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. Later in the afternoon, Caleb stepped outside again. The sky had not fully cleared, but there was a break in the clouds toward the west where light began to stretch across the fields. He stood there for a long time, looking out over the land, not with the detachment he had carried before, but with a kind of awareness that something within his space had shifted. The ranch was still the same, the work still remained, the silence still existed, but it was no longer absolute. Behind him, the sound of the door opening reached the porch. Lydia stepped out, holding a light shawl around her shoulders. She did not approach too closely, only stood at a respectful distance beside him. They both looked forward without speaking for a long moment. "It feels different here," she said finally, her voice calm but thoughtful. Caleb nodded slightly, his eyes still on the horizon. "It is not the land," he replied after a pause. "It is what moves through it." Lydia understood that he was not speaking about weather or time. She looked toward the house where her daughters were now visible through the open window, their silhouettes moving gently inside the warm light. For the first time since their arrival, there was no urgency in her expression. Only a quiet acceptance that whatever this place was becoming, it was no longer defined solely by survival. Caleb remained still beside her, and although neither of them said anything further, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something unfinished, but no longer uncertain. The first sound that broke the morning calm was not a voice, but wind. It moved across the ranch in slow, uneven waves, brushing through the dry grass and pressing lightly against the wooden walls of the house, as if testing whether everything inside would hold. Inside, life had already begun its steady rhythm. Lydia Harper was kneeling near the stove, carefully stirring a thin pot of porridge, her movements slower now, more confident than they had been in the early days. The children were awake earlier than usual, gathered near the table in a loose circle, their voices soft but no longer hesitant. The eldest girl was helping the youngest braid a section of her hair, her fingers moving gently, as if she had done it many times before. Caleb Whitmore was outside, but not far. He stood near the edge of the yard, looking toward the open fields where the horizon stretched endlessly. There was something different in the way he stood now. Not guarded in the same way, not distant in the same absolute sense. He still carried silence, but it no longer defined him entirely. He turned slightly when he heard movement behind him. The youngest child had stepped outside, holding a small cup of water in both hands. She walked carefully across the uneven ground, her steps small but determined. When she reached him, she stopped and looked up without speaking, offering the cup with the same quiet seriousness she had shown before. Caleb looked down at her for a moment, then accepted it. He drank slowly, then handed it back with a faint nod. She did not leave immediately. Instead, she stood there beside him, following his gaze toward the fields. Inside the house, Lydia noticed the exchange through the open door. She did not interrupt. She simply watched, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. There was a sense forming now, not of arrival or departure, but of continuity, as if the days were no longer isolated events, but parts of something gradually unfolding. Later in the morning, the children began moving more freely between inside and outside. The middle girls carried a small basket of folded cloth to the porch, setting it down carefully as they discussed where it should be placed. The eldest followed them shortly after, pausing near the door before stepping out fully into the light. Caleb had returned to the barn briefly, checking a few tools and adjusting a loose board near the entrance. Lydia walked toward him after a moment, carrying a small piece of cloth in her hands. She stopped a few feet away, waiting until he noticed her presence. When he turned, she held it out. It was a simple repair, stitched carefully, not perfect but functional. He took it and examined it briefly before looking at her. "The children are learning quickly," she said. Caleb nodded slightly. "They have had to," he replied. There was no weight in the words, only acknowledgement. Inside the barn, one of the older tools had fallen from its hook during the night. Caleb bent to pick it up, and Lydia stepped inside after him without hesitation. The space was dimmer here, cooler, filled with the scent of wood and metal and time. She looked around briefly, noticing how organized yet untouched much of it still was. "You have lived here alone for a long time," she said quietly. Caleb paused for a moment before responding. Long enough that silence stopped feeling like absence. Lydia understood the meaning without needing further explanation. Outside, the children's laughter carried faintly through the open air. It was not loud, not constant, but it existed in small bursts, like something still learning how to survive in a new environment. Caleb and Lydia stepped out of the barn together, though not side by side in any deliberate sense. They simply moved in the same direction, toward the house, where life continued in its quiet, unstructured way. As they approached, the youngest child ran briefly across the yard, chasing something unseen in the grass, her movement light and unburdened. Caleb watched her without comment. Lydia noticed his expression, but she did not speak. The afternoon light began to soften again, stretching long across the ranch as the day slowly turned toward evening. The house stood at the center of it all, no longer just a structure of shelter, but something closer to a shared point of return. Caleb stopped near the porch, looking out over the land once more. Lydia stood beside him, not close enough to assume familiarity, but close enough that presence itself was no longer uncertain. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They did not need to. The space between them, once defined by distance and hesitation, now held something quieter. Not resolution, not yet, but a beginning that no longer felt fragile. The day began with an unusual stillness over the ranch, the kind that made every small sound feel closer than it actually was. The air carried a soft dryness now, with the wind moving gently across the open fields instead of pushing against them, and the sky above stretched wide in a pale blue that seemed almost uncertain, as if it had not fully decided what kind of day it wanted to become. Inside the house, the rhythm of life had settled into something more natural than before. Lydia Harper moved through the kitchen area with quiet confidence, preparing a simple breakfast from what little remained in storage, her hands no longer trembling with hesitation, but guided by familiarity she had slowly built over the past days. Her daughters were already awake, gathered near the table, their voices soft but steady, sharing small pieces of conversation that no longer carried fear in every pause. The eldest was helping the younger ones organize their small belongings, placing them neatly along the edge of a wooden shelf as if order itself could create comfort. Caleb Whitmore stood outside near the front of the ranch house, his attention fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky. He was not searching for anything in particular, but rather observing the way the world around him had begun to feel different without changing in any visible way. The ranch was still the same in structure and shape, the fence lines still worn by time, the barn still holding the quiet weight of years, yet something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer only his space. It was becoming something shared, though not in any forced or declared sense. The youngest child stepped outside again, this time without hesitation. She carried a small cloth bag in her hands and walked directly toward Caleb, stopping at a comfortable distance. She looked up at him, waiting. Caleb turned slightly, acknowledging her presence, and she held out the bag. Inside were small items the children had gathered, carefully arranged, each one simple but meaningful in its own way. He took the bag gently, looking inside without comment. She remained there beside him for a moment, not asking for anything, simply existing in the same space. Inside the house, Lydia noticed this interaction from the window, her expression calm but thoughtful. She did not interrupt. Instead, she turned back to the table where her daughters were finishing their breakfast. The middle girls were laughing quietly at something small, a shared moment that would have gone unnoticed in another life, but now carried weight simply because it existed at all. Caleb returned to the barn later that morning, followed after a short time by Lydia. She did not announce her presence when she entered. She simply stepped inside and observed the space, noticing how everything was arranged with careful precision, yet untouched in many ways that suggested long periods of solitude. Caleb was adjusting a section of rope near a wooden beam when he noticed her. He paused briefly but did not stop what he was doing. "The children are asking questions now," Lydia said after a moment. Caleb continued working as he replied, "That means they are beginning to feel safe enough to wonder." Lydia considered this before responding. Safety is not something they are used to keeping for long. Caleb tied off the rope and stepped back slightly, looking toward her. "Neither am I," he said simply. The words were not heavy, but they carried honesty that did not require elaboration. Outside the barn, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint sound of movement from the house, where the children continued their quiet routines. Lydia stepped closer to the doorway, but did not leave the barn immediately. "You do not speak much about what happened before," she said carefully. Caleb looked toward the open door, where light filtered in from outside. "Some things are not spoken because they are already understood by the silence they leave behind," he replied. Lydia nodded slowly, accepting the answer without needing more. Later, all of them gathered outside near the porch as the afternoon light began to soften again. The children were more active now, moving freely between the yard and the house, their presence no longer cautious but integrated into the space itself. One of the younger girls pointed toward the fields and asked a simple question about how far the land stretched. Caleb answered without hesitation, describing the distance in practical terms, not as limitation but as openness. Lydia listened as she stood beside him, noticing how naturally he had begun to include himself in these small exchanges. The day continued without disruption, without sudden change, but with a steady sense of something building beneath the surface. When evening approached, Caleb stood again at the edge of the porch, looking out across the ranch as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Lydia joined him after a moment, holding a light shawl over her shoulders. The children were inside now, their voices faint but present, blending into the quiet hum of the house. Neither Caleb nor Lydia spoke immediately. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was simply part of the space they now shared. After a long pause, Lydia said softly, "I think they are beginning to believe this is real." Caleb did not take his eyes off the horizon when he replied, "So am I." And in that moment, without anything being declared or resolved, the ranch felt less like a place of survival and more like the beginning of something neither of them had fully expected to find again. The morning arrived with a different kind of weight over the ranch, not heavy like a storm, but dense in a way that made every movement feel slightly more deliberate than usual. The sky was covered in a thin layer of gray clouds that softened the light across the fields, turning the wide Texas landscape into something muted and quiet, as if the world itself had slowed down to observe what was unfolding here. Inside the house, the sound of daily life had become more consistent. Lydia Harper moved between the kitchen and the main room with practiced ease now, her steps no longer uncertain. The children were already awake, their routines forming naturally without instruction, each of them finding small responsibilities that made them feel part of the space rather than guests within it. The eldest was helping one of her sisters fold a blanket neatly along the edge of the couch, while the younger ones arranged small objects on the table, treating them with a seriousness that came from learning stability after instability. Caleb Whitmore stood near the barn entrance, his hands resting on the wooden frame of the doorway as he looked out across the ranch. The land was still the same in structure, the fences still weathered, the dirt paths still uneven, but there was a subtle shift in how it felt to him now. It no longer represented only solitude. It carried presence in a way that was slowly becoming normal rather than unfamiliar. He turned his head slightly when he heard movement from the house. Lydia stepped outside, carrying a folded piece of cloth in her hands. She walked toward him with steady steps, stopping at a respectful distance, as she always did when something felt important but not yet defined. "The children are asking about town," she said quietly. Caleb looked toward the horizon before responding. "There is a small supply road about 10 miles east. It leads to a general store." Lydia nodded, absorbing the information without immediately deciding what it meant. "They are beginning to think about more than just staying here," she said. Caleb understood the implication without needing further explanation. It was not a concern. It was a sign of change. Later that morning, the children gathered near the porch, watching as Caleb prepared a wagon that had not been used in some time. The wood creaked softly as he checked the wheels and tightened the harness, his movements steady and familiar. The eldest girl approached first, observing carefully before asking if she could help. Caleb handed her a simple task without hesitation, showing her how to secure one of the straps properly. She followed his instructions with focused attention, her hands learning the rhythm of work rather than simply watching it. Lydia stood nearby, observing quietly as the interaction unfolded. It was not dramatic or unexpected, but it carried a sense of integration that had not been present before. The children were no longer only adjusting to the ranch. They were beginning to participate in it. By midday, Caleb, Lydia, and the children prepared to travel to the small supply road. The wagon moved slowly along the dirt path, its wheels pressing into the soft ground, leaving behind faint tracks that disappeared almost as soon as they were formed. The youngest child sat close to Lydia, while the others sat together on the opposite side, their eyes moving between the passing landscape and the steady figure of Caleb guiding the horses. The journey was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The silence carried observation rather than distance. When they finally reached the small settlement, it was modest in appearance, consisting of a general store, a small stable, and a few scattered buildings that stood along the road like resting points rather than destinations. Caleb helped the children down from the wagon before tying the reins securely. Inside the store, the sound of footsteps on wooden floors mixed with the quiet exchange of goods and conversation. Lydia moved carefully through the space, selecting a few essential items, while the children followed closely, taking in the unfamiliar environment with cautious curiosity. Caleb remained near the entrance for a moment before entering, his attention shifting between the surroundings and the group he had arrived with. It was not protection in the traditional sense. It was awareness. One of the storekeepers greeted them briefly, and Lydia responded politely, her voice calm but steady. The interaction was simple, transactional, yet it carried a sense of normalcy that felt distant from the early days of their arrival at the ranch. Outside, the wind moved gently through the open street, carrying dust and light across the wooden structures. Caleb stood for a moment, watching the wagon and the people moving in and out of the store. Lydia eventually joined him outside, holding a small bundle of supplies. "It feels different being out here," she said. Caleb nodded slightly. "Because you are no longer arriving somewhere uncertain," he replied. "You are returning somewhere familiar." Lydia considered his words, then looked toward her children who were waiting near the wagon. They were not afraid. Not entirely. That alone was new. As they prepared to leave the small settlement, the sky began to open slightly, allowing a soft stream of sunlight to break through the clouds. It touched the ground in uneven patches, lighting parts of the road ahead while leaving others in shadow. Caleb took the reins again, and the wagon began its slow return toward the ranch. Behind them, the small town faded into the distance. Ahead of them, the land stretched wide and unchanged, yet now it felt like something they were returning to rather than escaping from. And in that quiet transition between places, nothing was declared, nothing was resolved, but something had clearly shifted into a steadier form than before. The ranch was quiet in a way that felt deeper than simple silence, as if the land itself was resting after a long period of uncertainty. The afternoon light stretched across the open fields in wide, gentle bands, touching the fence posts and the barn roof with a warmth that made everything feel briefly suspended in time. Inside the house, the rhythm of life had become steady enough that it no longer felt like adjustment, but like continuation. Lydia Harper was at the table, carefully arranging what they had brought back from town. Her movements were deliberate, not rushed, as she placed each item in its proper place, creating order out of necessity and comfort out of repetition. The children were nearby, moving between the table and the window, their voices light but consistent, no longer shaped by uncertainty but by curiosity about the world beyond the ranch. The eldest daughter sat near the edge of the porch, watching the horizon with a calm focus that had slowly replaced the guarded tension she once carried. The younger ones were gathered around a small box of supplies, taking turns examining simple objects as if each one held meaning beyond its appearance. Caleb Whitmore stood outside near the fence line, his hands resting lightly on the top rail as he looked across the land. He was not working at that moment, not repairing or adjusting anything, simply observing. There was a difference now in how he experienced the space around him. It was no longer defined by isolation or obligation alone. It was defined by presence. Not just his own, but the presence of others who had gradually become part of the same daily rhythm. Lydia stepped outside after a while, holding a folded cloth in her hands. She stopped beside him without announcing her arrival, standing at a distance that felt natural rather than careful. "The children are asking about tomorrow," she said softly. Caleb did not look away from the fields immediately. "That is better than them only asking about yesterday," he replied. Lydia understood the meaning behind the words. It was not avoidance of the past, but recognition that attention was shifting forward. She leaned lightly against the wooden post beside him, her gaze following his toward the open land. "They are starting to talk about this place like it is theirs," she said after a pause. Caleb considered this quietly. "It becomes yours when you stop waiting for it to reject you," he said. Lydia did not respond right away. The idea settled between them without resistance. Inside the house, the sound of small laughter drifted through the open window. One of the younger girls had found something amusing in a simple task, and the others had joined in, their voices blending into a soft, steady rhythm that no longer felt out of place in the structure of the ranch. Caleb turned slightly toward the sound, not fully, but enough to acknowledge it. Lydia noticed the shift in his attention, but said nothing. Later that afternoon, Caleb walked toward the barn, and Lydia followed after a short delay. The children remained near the house, continuing their small activities, no longer needing constant direction. Inside the barn, the light was softer, filtered through wooden slats that created thin lines across the floor. Caleb checked a few tools out of habit, though there was no immediate task requiring them. Lydia watched him for a moment before speaking. "You have been quieter lately," she said. Caleb paused briefly, then set down the tool he was holding. "I have not needed to listen only to myself," he replied. Lydia nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing further. There was something about the space between them that had changed over time. It was no longer defined by uncertainty or careful distance, but by a kind of shared awareness that did not require constant explanation. Outside, the wind moved gently through the open doorway of the barn, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth. Caleb stepped toward the entrance and stood there for a moment, looking out toward the ranch house where the children were still visible through the open windows. Lydia joined him at the threshold, standing slightly behind and to the side, not intruding on his view, but sharing it. "They are settling," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "So are we," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried weight that did not need elaboration. The sun began to lower slowly toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The ranch, once defined by emptiness and endurance, now held movement that was no longer temporary. It was becoming routine, structure, and presence all at once. Caleb remained at the barn entrance for a while longer, while Lydia eventually turned back toward the house. Neither of them spoke again in that moment, because there was no need to define what had already begun to define itself. And in the quiet stretch of land between the barn and the house, the distance no longer felt like separation, but like part of the same shared life slowly taking shape. The morning light arrived quietly over the ranch, spreading across the wide Texas land in a soft golden tone that made everything feel steady and unchanged, yet subtly different in a way that was becoming more noticeable with each passing day. The air carried a gentle stillness, broken only by the occasional movement of wind through the grass and the distant sound of livestock settling into their early routines. Inside the house, life had become organized in a way that no longer required constant adjustment. Lydia Harper moved through the kitchen with calm efficiency, preparing a simple breakfast while her daughters carried out their morning tasks without instruction. The eldest daughter was helping the younger ones set the table, her movements patient and familiar now, as if she had always belonged in this space. The middle girl spoke quietly about small plans for the day, their voices no longer carrying hesitation, only curiosity and growing comfort. The youngest remained close to Lydia, following her movements as she prepared food, no longer afraid of distance or silence. Caleb Whitmore stood outside near the barn, his hands resting on the edge of a wooden post as he looked across the ranch. He was not working at that moment, only observing the land that had once defined his solitude but was now beginning to reflect something broader. There was a shift in how he experienced time here. It was no longer measured only by tasks or silence, but by presence. Not just his own, but the presence of others who had gradually become part of the same rhythm. Lydia stepped outside after a while, carrying a small cup of water. She stopped beside him without announcing herself, standing at a distance that felt natural rather than careful. "They are talking about staying longer," she said quietly. Caleb did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on the horizon for a moment before he spoke. "Then they are no longer counting days," he said. Lydia understood the meaning behind the words. It was not about permanence being declared, but about uncertainty beginning to fade. She looked toward the house where her daughters were visible through the open window, moving freely inside a space that no longer felt foreign to them. "They are beginning to call it home," she said after a pause. Caleb nodded slightly. "Home is not a place you decide quickly," he replied. "It is something that decides you slowly." Lydia did not argue. The words felt true in a way that did not require agreement. Later, the children gathered near the barn, watching Caleb adjust a section of fencing that had loosened slightly overnight. The eldest daughter approached carefully, asking if she could help. Caleb handed her a simple task without hesitation, showing her how to secure the wire properly. She followed his instructions with focused attention, her movements steady and precise. The younger girls watched from a short distance, observing without interruption, learning not just the action but the patience behind it. Lydia stood nearby, noticing how naturally this interaction had developed. It was no longer an adjustment of strangers sharing space. It was becoming cooperation without explanation. Inside the barn, Caleb paused for a moment after finishing the repair. He looked at the girl beside him, then toward Lydia, who had stepped closer to the entrance. "You learn faster than expected," he said to the girl. She nodded slightly, as if accepting the statement as both observation and acknowledgement. Lydia smiled faintly at the exchange, but said nothing. There was no need to define what was already taking shape through repetition and presence. As the afternoon progressed, the group returned to the house. The children moved ahead, their steps light across the yard, while Caleb and Lydia followed at a slower pace. The sun was higher now, casting a steady brightness over the ranch that softened the edges of the land. The house stood at the center of it all, no longer just a structure of shelter, but a space that had absorbed the rhythm of its occupants. Inside, the sound of movement continued, not chaotic, but coordinated in a quiet way that suggested familiarity had replaced uncertainty. Caleb stood near the doorway for a moment before entering fully. Lydia remained beside him briefly, both of them looking into the same space where the children were now gathered. "They are no longer waiting for permission to belong here," Lydia said softly. Caleb nodded once. "Neither are we," he replied. The words settled between them without weight or hesitation. There was no conclusion in them, only recognition. The day continued without interruption, each hour blending into the next with a steady consistency that no longer felt temporary. And as evening approached once again over the ranch, there was a sense that what had begun as survival had slowly, quietly, become something closer to life itself. The evening arrived over the ranch with a quiet softness that felt different from all the days that had come before it, as if the land itself had finally settled into a rhythm that no longer needed to be questioned or understood, only lived. The sky stretched wide in shades of warm amber and deep blue, with the last light of the sun resting gently over the fields like a final promise that the day would not end in uncertainty, but in calm continuation. Inside the house, the atmosphere carried a sense of completion that had not been present in the early days of their arrival. The sound of movement was no longer uncertain or tentative. It was natural, steady, and woven into the space as if it had always belonged there. Lydia Harper stood near the kitchen table, her hands resting lightly on its worn wooden surface, looking across the room where her 5 daughters moved freely, each of them engaged in small, ordinary actions that now felt extraordinary only because they had once been impossible. The eldest daughter was helping the younger ones arrange simple objects they had collected throughout the day, her expression calm and focused. The middle girls were speaking quietly about small plans for tomorrow, their voices no longer carrying fear or hesitation, only the ease of children who had begun to believe in the safety of the present. The youngest sat near the window, holding the repaired wooden toy in her hands, turning it slowly as if remembering not what it had been, but what it had become. Caleb Whitmore stood outside near the porch, his hands resting loosely on the wooden railing as he looked out across the ranch. The land stretched endlessly before him, familiar in structure but different in meaning now. It was no longer a place defined by isolation or endurance alone. It had become something shared, something that carried presence rather than absence. Lydia stepped outside after a moment, carrying a small cup of water, and stood beside him without speaking immediately. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was steady, comfortable in a way that neither of them would have recognized at the beginning of their time together. "They are sleeping easier now," Lydia said quietly after a moment, her gaze directed toward the soft glow of light coming from the windows. Caleb nodded slightly, his eyes still on the horizon. "That means they believe they are safe," he replied. Lydia looked at him briefly, then followed his gaze toward the open land. "And you," she said gently, "do you believe it as well?" Caleb did not answer immediately. The question lingered between them, not as pressure, but as reflection. He shifted slightly, as if choosing his words carefully, though the answer itself did not require complexity. "I believe something has changed," he said finally. Lydia waited, allowing the silence to continue rather than interrupt it. Inside the house, laughter rose softly from the children, light and unguarded, filling the space with a sound that had once been absent entirely. Caleb turned slightly toward the house, listening. It was not loud, not overwhelming, but it carried something steady within it, something that did not disappear when acknowledged. Lydia followed his gaze, her expression softening as she watched her daughters through the open window. The light inside the house reflected gently against the glass, blending with the fading daylight outside. After a long pause, Caleb spoke again, his voice lower, shaped not by hesitation but by certainty that had taken time to form. "When I first saw you at the door," he said, "I thought I was being asked to carry something I did not know how to hold again." Lydia remained still, listening without interruption. Caleb continued, his eyes still on the house. But what came was not weight. It was presence, and presence does not break a man. It reminds him he is still standing. Lydia's breath slowed slightly, her attention fixed on the space between his words and the quiet around them. Caleb turned slightly toward her then, not fully, but enough to meet her presence beside him. "You said you have 5 daughters," he said softly. Lydia nodded, remembering the first day, the rain, the uncertainty. Caleb looked toward the house once more. "Then I have 6 reasons to smile." The words settled into the evening air without force, without need for explanation. Lydia did not respond immediately. Instead, she followed his gaze to where her daughters were now visible through the window, their movements calm, their voices steady, their presence no longer fragile but real. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ranch around them remained still, the fields stretching outward beneath the fading light. The barn standing quiet in the distance, the house glowing softly at its center. Nothing dramatic changed in that moment. Nothing was declared or finalized, but something fundamental had completed its quiet transformation. Lydia finally smiled, not in relief alone, but in recognition. Caleb remained beside her, his posture steady, his expression no longer shaped by solitude, but by something that had slowly, without demand or expectation, become part of his life. And as the last light of the day faded beyond the horizon, the ranch no longer felt like a place of survival or chance encounter, but like a beginning that had finally decided to stay.